Hello everyone. Today we're going to have a little comparative session comparing the chimpanzee skeleton to that of the human. To begin with here, we'll start up at the top. This portion is known as the skull on the chimpanzee. If we were to remove the lower mandible here, this, just like the human, be referred to as the cranium. Just a few quick differences. We did another session where we spent a lot of time talking about the skull of the chimpanzee, but just to review a couple things, you notice they have a smaller brain case. There is a forward sloping nasal area. They have non-projecting nasal bones, a very heavy, thick brow, receding forehead, and the chimpanzee does not have a chin. All the greater apes do not have a chin. Then we have the incisors. We have very large, aggressive canine teeth, premolars and molars. The mandible is much thicker on the chimpanzee skull than that of the human. But essentially, they do have a larger brain in comparison to the size of the skull compared to many other animal species. It's important to note, so then we have the vertebral column. The vertebral column connects to the back of the head. They spend most of their time walking on all fours. Chimpanzees can walk upright for short distances, but they prefer to walk on all fours, and therefore for the most part, they are quadrupeds. So as you can see, the foramen magnum is here at the back of the head. This cervical vertebrae connect to the back portion, whereas a human, it would come up through the bottom. They have seven cervical vertebrae. They are mammals. All mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae, with the exception of the sloth and the manatee. The two-toed sloth, three-toed sloth, and the manatee do not have 7. We can see down here is our the hyoid bone of the chimpanzee. Humans also have a hyoid bone. So there's many similarities between the human and the greater ape. And we get down here to the thoracic cage, also referred to as a rib cage, but it's the thoracic cage. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae. The humans have 12 sets of ribs. This will be a little bit different between the humans and the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee has 13 sets of ribs, so they have an additional set of ribs. That means they have an additional thoracic vertebrae. Excuse me. And we have 1 more lumbar vertebrae. The chimpanzee has 1 less lumbar vertebrae. So 13 sets of ribs, 13 thoracic ribs in the thoracic cage, and they have 13 thoracic vertebrae. The interesting thing to this is, because there are a lot of similarities, we have the sternum, just like in the human. We have what are referred to as true ribs and false ribs, and so does the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee has 7 true ribs, meaning they all connect via intercostal cartilage directly to the sternum, and they have 2 sets of ribs that connect to the costal cartilage of the 7th rib, and then connect to the sternum. And we have 2 sets of floating ribs, and the chimpanzee has 3 sets of floating ribs. So that is some of the variation. We only have the 2 floating ribs, they have 3. Other than that, it's relatively similar. The scapulas sit back up here. They're on the back. When you a lot of quadrupeds, you'll see the rib cage gets much thinner through here. The scapula tends to turn onto the side and carries most of the weight. However, on the chimpanzee, the scapula still sits on the back portion of the thoracic cage. We see a large spine of the scapula through here, the acromion process where it connects to the clavicles. So just like humans, they have clavicles, they have scapula, basically identical structure. Their form changes a little bit because of their locomotion, and that's what creates some of the changes. But in general, it's relatively the same. Now, because they spend so much more time on walking on all fours, and their arms do a significant amount of the work in their everyday functioning, they're humerus. They have a humerus just like the humans, it's one of the larger bones in the body. It's very thick, it's very powerful, it's very strong. And humans, our femur would be the thickest, strongest bone. In the chimpanzee, it is the humerus. So they have a humerus, they also have the radius, the bone that radiates across. Just like humans, it can turn back and forth, it can pronate. This is the radius, the section back here. This is the ulna. They have very large forearms, and they're quite powerful. They're dispersed a little further apart than humans. This is the olecranon, which is the back of the elbow, and this portion is all the ulna, the head of the ulna down here. And then we come down in here to the hands. Their hands are very similar to humans, but their fingers are much longer. But they have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, all the same number of bones that we have in our human hands. They have an opposable thumb. They are knuckle walkers, meaning they spend most of their time walking on their knuckles. That's another unique thing that's different. So they spend most of their time on all fours. They're knuckle walkers. Their fingers are very long. Their arms, in proportion to the legs, are much longer. Humans, the opposite. Our arms are shorter than the length of our legs. So that's another. Bone structure is similar, but due to the change in the function and locomotion, that is definitely different. Then we get down here. So we have the vertebral column. And again, we have true vertebrae and false vertebrae. The true vertebrae all are capable of movement. Then we get down in here to the sacrum and the coccyx, just like in the human, and it is fused to the pelvis, and these are immovable, so those are the false vertebrae. The true vertebrae are the lumbar, thoracic, and cervical up in here. So those are all true vertebrae. Then we have the pelvis. If you notice, the pelvis tends to be flatter, and it's much longer than the human pelvis. The pelvis is somewhat bowl-shaped, and we are made so that it's easier for us to walk upright. We are bipedal. They spend more time on their fours, so their structure is definitely different in the pelvis. Their legs are closer together, much closer together than humans. Humans tend to taper in at an angle like this, their legs, and the chimpanzees will go more directly upright. So that is another thing that is different. Now they have the same bone structure. This is the femur, there's the patella, they have the large tibia, they have the fibula. The foot is definitely different than ours in terms of they have an opposable big toe. Okay, humans do not have an opposable big toe. The structure in terms of carpals in our hands and then tarsals in our feet is similar. Then we have metacarpals in our hands. They have metatarsals in their feet. We have phalanges, they have phalanges. So that part of the structure is similar. So tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges, but they have an opposable big toe so that they can grasp onto branches and so forth much easier when they are out in their natural habitat. They have the large calcaneus that comes out in the end where their Achilles tendon connects to. That's the same as the human. They have the talus bone, same as the human. The foot moves back and forth like a hinge joint, same as a human. So a lot of those elements, as you can see, are very different. The difference being is their form of locomotion is what changes how they function and how the bones have developed. So in terms of the spinal column, another thing that's important to note is they have kind of a C curve here, whereas the humans will come up here and then it dips back in and comes out. So the bipedal locomotion has changed the human spinal column to some extent. So this definitely sticks up a little stronger. It's more rounded in this direction. We do not have that S curve that runs through there. So just a quick rundown again, a quick overview. We have the skull, we have the vertebral column, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx, same as the human. We have the thoracic cage, somewhat similar in shape to the human. It tapers off a little bit more to the top, or a little bit more rounded up here, and they have a little bit more cone shaped, I think is a good way to put it. Scapula, just like ours, we both have scapulas, both have clavicles, both have the hyoid bone, both have the sternum. Again, the chimpanzee has 13 sets of ribs, whereas the human only has 12 sets of ribs. They have 3 sets of floating ribs. The human has 2 sets of floating ribs. We have 7 sets of true ribs. The ape also has 7 sets of true ribs. We have 5 sets of false ribs. They have 6 sets of false ribs because they have this extra floating rib. So somewhat that is one of the differences in the thoracic cage. In the arms, it's a nice thing to remember is they have 1 bone followed by 2 bones, followed by lots of little bones, followed by digits. And that tends to be a common trait in a lot of mammals. So we have the humerus, large and powerful. We have the radius. We have the ulna, the olecranon, the back portion of the ulna. Then we have the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Then we get back, we have this long, flat pelvis, much smaller in comparison to the human, much smaller femur. They have a tibia, then we have the tibia right through here, the fibula right here on the outside, and the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. Remember, chimpanzees, the greater apes, all have an opposable big toe. They have an opposable thumb and an opposable big toe. Patella, just like the humans. One thing that's sort of interesting to know is the chimpanzee, it has to keep its knees bent at all times, whether it's resting or in movement, so their muscles never get rest. Humans have the ability to stand upright. We can lock our leg back and allow the muscles to relax and to rest. The chimpanzee, at all times, their muscles are constantly being used. So that's another unique aspect to the chimpanzee. So, and if you'd like, be sure and reference the section I did on comparing the chimpanzee and the bonobo skull to the human skull, and you can get a lot of really specific detailed information about the head. I hope you find this useful, and it's really interesting how similar the chimpanzee skeleton is to that of the human. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.